Grand Rising, Grand Rising. How's everyone doing this rising?
Peace, 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 everybody.
Let's see. So far, we got I Am Flying Squirrel, peace. Peace, Brittany Davis. This rising will be finishing with Joseph Brant. We're going back in further with Joseph Brant, but also remembering that yesterday during the was it Cornstalk? It was no Corn Planter. Doing his story, you come to find out through his DNA that you have presidents that's tied back in to Indian tribes, showing that you have powerful political leaders of influence also being tied back into American Indian tribes. Mind blowing.
Yeah, and people were saying, "Get off our land." How? So can't
I
really
mean,
be.
yeah, you hit it right on the head. That's kind of interesting. They're trying to tell somebody to leave who knows their genealogy when most of us don't know ours. And then again, make no mistake about it. This is not saying nobody's innocent or from the responsibility of damages that's done. It's just amazing that doing a lot of these stories that the links and ties in the links that you're finding that's tying in explain why a lot of things in our lifetime play out the way they play out. TMH, anything you wanted to add it on before we move forward, or oh no, see, not on this one. All right, let me bring this up real quick. All right, give me a second to pull them back up. I mean, weird, very weird with these stories. And if I'm right, we left off with him. He did marriages, through the marriages, he was in his career. If I believe, let me look down and see. Okay, we did that part on November.
Peace to the chat. Mic check. Mic.
Just pulling up these stories from him real quick. Okay. We left off at wounded and service in Detroit area from 1780 to 1783.
All right, you post that up,
Oh no, grabbing it and posting it now.
or you can send, or if it's already somewhere, I can post it up. However, you can post it up. For some reason, it don't give me the hyperlink when I post the websites in the chat.
Yeah, I think I got to give you the
It's messed up.
probably have to log in to let you do it. I can
Okay.
pass that over.
Yeah.
All right, just finna post this in the chat and we'll finish. But so far, you ever imagine one person can be responsible for so much?
Spreading like wildfire. Butterfly effect.
Like this dude. Model was, I'm gonna have my hands in everything. And went around like he actually meant it.
Yeah, like Future. How many baby mamas? I got 17 baby mamas. I'm leaving a legacy behind. You ain't gonna play with me.
Like this dude. And dude, like y'all play catch up. All right. I just posted the Joseph Brant link in the chat. Peace, Antonio Baptiste. Went around like he actually meant it. Chat screen. All right, so let me restart it where we was at. It says
like
early 1780, Bryant resumed small-scale attacks on American troops on white settlers, the Mohawk and Susquehanna River valleys. In February 1780, he and his party set out, and in April attacked Maplesfield. I just posted in mid-July. 1780 in the chat. Brant attacked on Dyer Village, on the Kawana Hall, as many of the nation fought as allies of the American colonists. Brant raids destroyed small-scale Oneida housing forces and white settlers. Some of the Oneida surrendered, but most took refuge at Fort Stanley. In February 1780, he and his party set out, and in April attacked Maplesfield. I just posted in mid-July 1780 in the chat. Okay. So traveling east, Brant's forces attacked towns on both sides of the Mohawk River. It says Kenjari on the south and Fort Plank. He burned his former hometown. I'm trying to see if we went through this one already. No. So he burned his former hometown of Kenjar because it had been reoccupied by American settlers. On the raiders' return up the valley, they divided into smaller parties, attacking Skuhara, Cherry Valley, and German Flats, joining with Butler's Rangers and the King's Royal Regiment of New York. Brant's forces were part of a third major raid on the Mohawk Valley, where they destroyed settlers' homes and crops. In August 1780, during a raid with the King's Royal Regiment of New York in the Mohawk Valley, about 150,000 bushels of wheat were burned. Bryant was wounded in the heel at the Battle of Clarksville. It goes on to state, in April 1781, Brant was sent west to Fort Detroit to help defend against Virginians. George Rogers Clark's expedition into the Ohio country. In August 1781, Brant soundly defeated a detachment of Clark's forces, capturing about 100 Americans and ending the American threat to Detroit. Brant's leadership was praised by British Army officers whom described him as an intelligent, charismatic, and very brave commander. He was wounded in the leg and spent the winter 1781 and 82 at the fort. During 1781 and 1782, Brant tried to keep the disaffected Western Iroquois nations loyal to the crown before and after the British surrender at Yorktown in April 1781. It goes on to state, in June 1782, Brant and his Indians went to Fort Oswego, where they helped rebuild the fort. In July 1782, he and 460 Iroquois raided Forts Herkimer and Dayton, but they did not cause much serious damage. By 1782, there was not much left to destroy in New York, and during the raids, Grant's forces killed 9 men and captured some cattle. Sometime during the raid, he received a letter from Governor Mr. Hellman, announcing peace negotiations, recalling the war party, and ordering a cessation of hostilities. Brant denounced the British no offensive war policy as a betrayal of the Iroquois and urged the Indians to continue the war. but they were unable to do so without British supplies. Other events in the New World in Europe, as well as changes in British government, had brought reconsideration of British national interests on the American continent. The new governments recognized their priority to get Britain out of its four interconnected wars, and time might be short. Though a long and involved process between March and the end of November 1782, the preliminary peace treaty between Great Britain and America would be made. It would become public knowledge following its approval by the Congress of the Confederation. On April 15, 1783, and May 1783, a bit of Brant, when he learned about the Treaty of Paris, wrote, England had sold the Indians to Congress. Much to Brant's dismay, not only did the Treaty of Paris fail to mention the Haudenosaunee, but the British negotiators took the viewpoint that the Iroquois would have to negotiate their own peace treaty with the Americans, who Brant knew were a vengeful mood against him. Like all of the Indians who fought for the crown, Brant felt a profound sense of betrayal when he learned of the Treaty of Paris, complaining that the British diplomats in Paris did nothing for the Indian loyalists. Nearly another year would pass before the other foreign parties to the conflict signed treaties on September 3rd, 1783, with that being ratified by Congress on January 14, 1784, and formally ending the American Revolutionary War. Further states, the American Revolutionary War is known to the Haudenosaunee.
What is it? Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee, yeah,
Haudenosaunee.
Haudenosaunee, yeah. The American Revolutionary War is known to the Haudenosaunee as the whirlwind that led to many of them being exiled from Kanaku to Canada, and the decision of Joseph and Marley Brant to be loyal to the crown as the best way of preserving the Haudenosaunee lands and life of way has been controversial, with many Haudenosaunee historians believing that neutrality would have worked better. However, Paxton noted that after the war, the United States imposed treaties that forced the Tuscarora and the Wandaya, who fought for the United States, to surrender most of their land to white settlement, which Paxton used to argue that the even all six nations had fought for the United States or remained neutral, they still would not have lost much of their land. In this context, Paxton maintained that the decision of Brant's siblings in 1775 to support the crown, which at least promised to respect the Haudenosaunee land rights, was the most rational under the circumstances. So what do you think about what we read so far before we go further?
Mic check.
1, 2, 1, 2.
My bad. What part was because I heard you say that it ended the formally ended the American Revolutionary War. And what he said about the being the what is it? The Indians being sold to Congress.
Yeah, because basically these are the Indians that helped the British fight against the Americans, the French, and other Indians. And they were promised, certain things, or thought they would get certain things for being loyal to the crown.
Hmm.
But as you see in the stated down here,
Yeah.
Britain had other things going on that was tapping its resources, mainly fighting the war on the other side with China. But that's another bill.
Yeah, exactly.
So they had to pull out of America. They no longer had the resources to finance these colonies, to finance these Indians, to be the military and might for these colonists. So as they was pulling out and they was doing peace treaties, the Iroquois learned that they would have to do their own peace treaty with America. And you heard what Brant said. The problem with that was the Americans didn't like him anyway.
Yeah.
So he was like, they felt screwed. Like, hold on, we done backed you up. We done supported you. Now y'all finna take off and go home. And we got to stay here and deal with these people that we was fighting. And we got to deal with our own people that we was fighting against.
Facts. Sound like Afghanistan.
All I can say is wow, wow, wow.
Yes, sir. That's crazy.
Well, you see the turn in of it. Because they also told you that the ones that backed America still took lands from them. I guess either way you was gonna get it.
Hmm. Now, does that coincide with that 2 million acres that was taken from old boy the other day that we talked about? Like America taking things back after giving it.
Oh no, Britain took that back from him.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, because remember he wasn't friends with the colonists, the American colonists. They didn't like him like that. He was
So
a
other
loyalist to the
nations are
crown.
practicing Indian giving, pretty much.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. All right.
And now we finna go on to that was during the war. That's a little more history after the war. And for those who's coming in or probably missed it during the week, we're going over through the stories of Joseph Brant because it shows how a lot of this ties into what's going on to present day. It also shows us the importance of genealogy and knowing who you are. Because, like we found out from yesterday's Rising Show, you have U.S. presidents and congressmen and senators that's tying back into tribes through their genealogy, through bloodlines. So we're saying it again. Could it be a lot of these situations we find ourselves in is because we always say it. They know who we are. They know who they are, but we don't know who we are. So just a little update on why we're going through this, and we'll continue. It states in the ending, the conflict with the Treaty of Paris, 1783, both Britain and the United States ignored the sovereignty of the Indians. Britain had accepted the American demand that the boundary of British Canada should revert to its location after the 7 Years' War with France in 1763, and not the revisions of the Quebec Act. As war with the colonists approached, the difference between the two lines was the whole area south of the Great Lakes, north of the Ohio River, and east of the Mississippi, in which the Six Nations and Western Indian tribes were previously accepted as sovereign. For the Americans, the area would become the Northwest Territory, from which six and a half new states would later emerge. While British promises of protection of the Iroquois domain had been an important factor in the Six Nations' decision to ally with the British, they were bitterly disappointed when Britain ceded it and regarded it as territory of the United States. Just weeks after the final treaty signing, the American Congress on September 22nd stated its vision of these Indian lands with the Confederation. Congress Proclamation of 1783, it prohibited the extinguishment of Aboriginal title in the United States without the consent of federal government and was diverged from the policy of the British Proclamation of 1763. Brent's status as a successful war leader who was popular with the warriors, his relationships with various British officials, and his marriage to Danwansan, the clan mother of the Turtle Clan, made him a spokesman for his people, and Brant emerged as a powerful leader after the war. That what had been during the war in 1783. Brant consulted with Governor Holliman on Indian land issues, and in late summer of 1783, Brant traveled west and helped initiate the formation of the Western Confederacy. In his speeches during his trip, Brent advocated pan-Indianism. I'm going to read this again. In his speeches during his trip, Brent advocated pan-Indianism, saying that if First Nations people would only stick together, then the Americas might be held at bay while allowing the Indians to play off the British against the Americans. I'm
Hmm.
going to read this again.
One more time, please.
In his speeches during his trip, Brant advocated pan-Indianism, saying that if First Nations peoples would only stick together, then the Americans might be held at bay while allowing the Indians to play off the British against the Americans. Brant argued that if all of the Indians held together to negotiate peace with the United States, then they would obtain better terms, as he argued the Indians needed to improve the Americans, needed to prove to the Americans that they were not conquered peoples. In August and September, he was present at unit meetings in the Detroit area, and on September 7th at Lower Sandusky, Ohio, was a principal speaker at an Indian council attended by Wyandots, Delawares, Shawnees, Cherokee, Ottawas, and Mingos. The Iroquois and 29 other Indian nations agreed to defend the 1768 Fort Stanwix Treaty boundary line with European settlers being denied in the Indian nation the ability to cede any land without common consent of all. At the same time, Brant in his talks with Handmaid was attempting to have a new homeland created for the Iroquois. Initially, the new homeland was to be the Bay of Quinte, but Brant decided he wanted the Grand River Valley instead. Helaman did not want to give the Grand River Valley to the Iroquois, but with many Handusan warriors openly threatening to attack the British, whom they accused of betraying them with the Treaty of Paris, Helaman did not want to alienate Brant, the most pro-British of the chiefs. Brant was at Fort Stanwix from late August into September for initial peace negotiations between the Six Nations and New York State officials, but he did not attend later. Treaty negotiations held there with the Commissioner of the Continental Congress in October. Say Brand expressed extreme indignation on learning that the commissioner had detained as hostages several prominent Six Nations leaders and delayed his intended trip to England, attempting to secure their release. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix was signed on October 22nd, 1784, to serve as a peace treaty between the Americans and the Iroquois, but it forced the cession of most Iroquois land, as well as greater lands of other tribes to the west and south. Some reservations were established for the Wandea and the Tuscarora, who had been allies of the American rebels. With Brant's urging, and 3 days later, Helaman proclaimed a grant of land for the Mohawk Reserve on the Grand River in the western part of the province of Quebec, present-day Ontario. On October 25th, 1784, later in the fall at the Council of Buffalo Creek, the materns decided that the clan matrons decided that the Six Nations should divide, with half going to Handmaid Grant and the other half staying in New York. Starting in October 1784, Brant supervised the Iroquois settlement of the Grand River Valley, with some 1,800 people settled. At the newly settlement of Brantstown, modern Brantford, Ontario, Brant had the Mohawks move into two-room log houses, while the center of the community was the local Anglican church, St. Paul's. Brant built his own house at Brantstown, which was described as a handsome two-story house built after the manner of the white people, compared with the other houses. It may be called a palace. Brant's home had a white fence, a Union flag flying in front, and was described as being equipped with chinaware, fine furniture, English sheets, and a well-stocked liquor cabinet. The British historians Michael Johnson described the lifestyle of the Anglophile Bryant along the Grands as something of the style of the English squire. Deeply interested in the Angelic Church, Brant used his spare time to translate the Gospel of St. Mark from English into Mohawk. Let me say this again. Deeply interested in the Angelic Church, Brant used his spare time to translate the Gospel of St. Mark from English into Mohawk. Hold on 1 second. All right, sorry about that. I had to move something. And one more time. Deeply interested in the Angelic Church, Brant used his spare time to translate the Gospel of St. Mark from English into Mohawk. He had about 20 white and black servants and slaves. He had about 20 white and black servants and slaves. Brant thought the government made too much over the keeping of slaves, as captives were used for servants in Indian practice. He had a good farm of mixed crops and also kept cattle, sheep, and hogs. He had about 20 white and black servants and slaves. Brant thought the government made too much over the keeping of slaves, as captives were used for servants in Indian practice. He
Hmm.
had a good farm of mixed crops and also kept cattle, sheep, and hogs. It goes on more. Brent was nostalgic for the Kankiki, Kanaki, and as much possible, Brent tried to recreate the world he had left behind in the Grand River Valley. He wanted to see the world as it was before the war.
Mic check. Mic check. Mic check. Brant was nostalgic for Kentucky, and as much possible, Brant tried to recreate the world he had left behind in the Grand River Valley. As part of Brant's efforts to recreate Kentucky on the Grand, he tried unsuccessfully to persuade all of the Haudenosaunee who gone into exile into Canada to settle on the Grand River Valley. Many of the Haudenosaunee who went into exile preferred to take up the British offer on land on the Bay of Quinte, which was further from the United States. Let me check the chat and make sure we're still here, because I don't know what happened. Within the Mohawk people, the traditional division between those living in the town of Thayendanegea and those living in the town of Kanajohari persisted, with most of the Thayendanegea Mohawks preferring the Bay of Quinte to the Grand River Valley. Brant did not discourage whites from settling around the Grand River Valley, and at the beginning of every May, Brant hosted a reunion of Loyalist veterans from New York. At Brantstown, veterans of Brant's volunteers, the Indian Department, and Butler's Rangers would meet to remember their war services, while Brant and other former officers would give speeches to the veterans amid much dancing, drinking, and horse racing to go along with the reunions. Though the Grand River Valley had been given to the Iroquois, Brant allowed the white veterans of Brant's volunteers to settle on his land. The very first white settlers on the Grand were Hendrick Nels and his family, the Huff brothers, John and Hendrick, Adam Young and his family, the Dostetter, and all veterans of the Brant's volunteers whom Brant invited to settle. Brant was trying to recreate the human geography of, as quote unquote human geography, of, let me get this word, okay, Kanienke, along the Grand, as the families he allowed to settle by the Grand River had all been his neighbors in Kanienke before the war. Brant gave leases with an average size of 400 acres to former loyalists along the Grand River, which became an important source of revenue for the Iroquois, as well as creating a multiracial and multicultural world that Brant had grown up in. Not all the Iroquois appreciated Brant's willingness to allow the white veterans to settle in the Grand River Valley, with two Mohawk veterans, Aaron and Isaac Hill, threatening at a community meeting to kill Brant for bringing the white people to settle on their lands, which ended the Hills leaving for the Bay of Quinte. Ended with the Hills leaving for the Bay of Quinte. Paxton wrote that European and American writers coming from patriarchal culture almost completely ignored the clan mothers and tended to give Iroquois headmen, orators, and sachems for far more power than what they possessed, and it is easy to exaggerate Brant's power. However, Paxson noted that way in which the critics like the Hills attacked Brant as the author of certain policies, quote, suggests that Brant was no empty vessel. Rather, he had transformed his wartime alliances into broad-based peacetime coalition capable of forwarding a specific agenda, end quote. Much to everyone's surprise, Molly Brant did not settle at Brantstown, instead settling in Kingston. Molly wanted the best education for her 8 children and felt Kingston offered the better schools than what were to be found in the settlement run by her brother. It's messed up. In November 1785, Brant traveled to London to ask King George III for assistance in defending the Indian Confederacy from attack by the Americans. The government granted Brant a generous pension compensated for only a fraction of their property losses. The crown promised to pay the Mohawk some 15,000 euros and to pay both, I believe that's euro, or is that pounds? No. And to pay both Joseph and his sister Molly pensions for their war service. During this time in London, Brant attended masquerade balls, visited the freak shows, dined with the debauched Prince of Wales, and finished the Anglican Mohawk prayer book that he had begun before the war. He also took a diplomatic trip to Paris, returning to Quebec City in June 1786. Let's see. Upon his return, Brant was notably more critical of the British, for instance, calling the colonial secretary, Lord Sydney, a stupid blockhead who did not understand the Iroquois. At the same time, Brant's relations with John Johnson declined, with Johnson siding with the Hills against Brant's land policies along the Grand River Valley. In December 1786, Brant, along with the leaders of Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, Wyandot, Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations met at the Wyandot village of Brownstown and renewed the wartime Confederacy in the West by issuing a statement to the American government declaring the Ohio River as the boundary between them and the whites. Nevertheless, despite Brant's efforts to produce an agreement favorable to the Brownstown Confederacy and to the British interest, he also would be willing to compromise later with the United States. In 1789, a trivial incident strained Brant's relations with the British. Brant attempted to enter Fort Niagara carrying his weapons and was told by a sentry that as an Indian he would have to lay down his arms. An indignant Brant refused, saying that as both a Mohawk warrior chief and as a British Army officer, he would keep his weapons, and the commandant of Fort Niagara agreed that Brant would enter with his weapons. Nonetheless, the incident left a sour taste in Brant's mouth as he noted that white officers in the British Army were not asked to remove their weapons when entering the fort. From 1790 onward, Brant had been planning on selling much of the land along the Grand River granted by the Haldimand Proclamation and using the money from the sales to finance the modernization of the Haudenosaunee community to allow them equal standing with the European population. Mic check. Mic check. Where am I? 1 second. Mic check, Bones. Radio silence. Mic check. Peace, LJ Free. Let me get back to it. All right. In 1790, after Americans attacked the Western Confederacy in the Northwest Indian War, sending General Josiah Harmar on a putative mission, expedition, member tribes asked Brant and the Six Nations to enter the war on their side. Brant refused. He instead asked Lord Dorchester, the new governor of Quebec, for British assistance. Dorchester also refused, but later in 1794, he did provide the Indians with arms and provisions. After the defeat of General Josiah Harmar in 1790 at the hands of Little Turtle, the United States became interested in having Brant mediate. As their war secretary, Henry Knox wrote several letters to Brant asking him to persuade Little Turtle of the Western Confederacy to lay down his arms. Harmar's defeat proved to the U.S. government that Indians of the Northwest were not conquered peoples, quote unquote, and it would require a war to bring them under U.S. authority. Brant exaggerated his influence with the Western Confederacy in his letters to U.S. officials, knowing if the Americans were courting him, then the British would likewise engage in gestures to keep his loyalty. Brant was attempting to revive the traditional playoff, quote unquote, system in order to strengthen the position of his people. However, Brant knew that the British were not willing to go to war with the United States to save the Western Confederacy, and his position was not as strong as it seemed. As a mediator, Brant suggested to the Americans that they cease white settlement in most of the lands west of the Ohio River, while advising the Western Confederacy to negotiate with the Americans, saying that after Harmar's defeat, they held the upper hand, and now was the time to negotiate peace before the Americans brought more military forces into the old Northwest. Brant also advised that the Americans negotiate with the Western Confederacy as a whole instead of with individual nations, and at the same time used his talks with the Americans to impress upon the British that they needed to have enlisting Brant's aid as a way of bringing British into the war on their side. In June 1791, Brant was publicly challenged by the representatives of the Western Confederacy to, quote, take up the hatchet, end quote, against the Americans, and by refusing his influence, whatever it was, on the Western Confederacy ended forever. Though Brant had warned the Western Confederacy that they were fighting a war that they could not hope to win, in November 1791, Little Turtle inflicted a crushing defeat on the American general Arthur St. Clair, which made Brant appear both cowardly and foolish. After St. Clair's defeat, Little Turtle sent Brant this message, quote, you, Chief Mohawk, what are you doing? Time was when you roused us to war and told us that if all the Indians would join with the king, they should be a happy people and become independent. In a very short time, you changed your voice and went to sleep and left us in the lurch, unquote. It was widely noted in the Northwest that amongst the victorious warriors who defeated St. Clair were the Shawnee, Miami, Ottawa, Wyandots, Chippewas, Potawatomi, Cherokee, Mingos, and Lepni, but none were from the Six Nations. In 1792, the American government invited Brant to Philadelphia, then the capital of the United States, where he met President George Washington and his cabinet. The Americans offered him a large pension and a reservation in upstate New York for the Mohawks to try to lure them back. Brant refused, but Pickering said that Brant did take some cash payments. George Washington told Henry Knox in 1794 to, quote, buy Captain Brant off at almost any price, end quote. Brant attempted to compromise peace settlement between the Western Confederacy and the Americans, but he failed. In 1793, Brant spoke at a council meeting of the Western Confederacy where he suggested that they accept the American settlements north of the Ohio River while excluding white settlement to the north to the rest of the land west of the Ohio as the price of peace. Brant was outvoted, and the assembled chiefs announced that no white settlement west of the Ohio were the only peace terms they were willing to accept. The war continued, and the Indians were defeated in 1794 at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The unity of the West Confederacy was broken with the Peace Treaty of Greenville in 1795. The defeat of the Western Confederacy led to the Americans losing interest in Brant as a mediator, causing the collapse of his attempts to play the British off against the Americans. Brant often clashed with General John Graves Simcoe, the governor of Upper Canada. In 1791, following tensions between the French speakers and the English speakers, the province of Quebec had been divided into two new colonies: Lower Canada, modern southern Quebec, and Upper Canada, modern southern Ontario. Brant had begun selling some of the land he owned along the Grand River to British settlers with the intention of investing the profits into a trust that would make the Six Nations economically and politically independent of the British. Simcoe sabotaged Brant's plans by announcing that the Six Nations were only allowed to sell land to the Crown, which would then resell it to the to white settlers. It's messed up. On 14 January 1793, Simcoe issued a quote patent end quote, to the Haldimand Proclamation, which stated that Brant's lands did not extend to the beginning of the Grand River as the Haldimand Proclamation had stated, and that Haudenosaunee did not have the legal right to sell or lease their land to private individuals, and instead were to deal with only the Crown. Brant rejected the Simcoe patent, saying that Simcoe did not the right to alter the Haldimand Proclamation. The question of whatever the Iroquois owned all the land to the beginning of the Grand River to its mouth, or not is still, as of the 21st century, part of an ongoing land dispute. Simcoe justified his quote patent unquote with reference to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which had forbidden white settlement west of the Ohio River, while at the same time giving the Indian. Brant disregarded that Simcoe's patent, and in 1795 to 96 sold blocks of land along the Grand River, receiving some 85,000 sterling together with interest of 51.19 annually. Simcoe disallowed these land sales as as illegal and refused to give the buyers land deeds, but he made no effort to evict the buyers who continued to own the land. Man.